So we are now joined by Chris Maisano. He is a Jacobin contributor and a Catalyst Journal board member. His most recent articles are The Liminal Left's Bid for Power, which appears in the new issue of Jacobin, and Is the Labor Movement Back, which is in the new issue of Catalyst. Chris, good to see you.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
So let's just dive into your articles. Your two recent articles are what you're here to talk about today. And I want to start with your Catalyst article, which looks at kind of the state of the labor movement. So obviously, over the last couple of months, I think we've really seen a lot of excitement around labor activity, right? Especially at the end of last year, we saw several high-profile strikes at John Deere and Kellogg and, elsewhere. And that led people to calling the month of October Striketober. And then, of course, now we're seeing a lot of renewed attention around unionization at Starbucks and in the service sector. And actually, it looks like just as of this week, a Staten Island Amazon warehouse has voted to unionize. So there's obviously a lot of, excitement, a lot of attention on labor activity, as I said. And I think kind of paired with that is the fact that we also have polls that show that the public is generally more supportive and more excited for labor than they have been in a long time. But that said, something you point out in your article is that while this is all happening, the union membership has not only just stagnated, it's basically fallen over the last decade. So, there's kind of a tension going on here, right? How should we make sense of this moment?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, exciting things going on, and then, but all taking place within the context of sort of the general trends of the last few decades, which haven't been great. Just to take a step back for a second, what I did with this piece was I used data that was very generously provided by researchers at Cornell's Institute for Labor and Industrial Relations Research. They run a really good strike tracker website that tracks strikes and labor protests all around the country. It's really a great tool and a great resource, and people should definitely check that out. And what I did was I basically took a file of their data and just took a look at it and tried to make sense of what was going on based in that data. To make a long story short, I think a few things stood out. For me, at least, when I took a look at that data. The first was that while, yes, there was definitely an uptick in labor protest and strikes in 2021 compared to most years in recent memory, when you compare the level of strike action to many of the high points of labor militancy from the 20th century, it really still pales in comparison. So from my point of view, you calling it a strike wave was probably a little bit of a stretch. Definitely something of a strike ripple compared to recent years. But still, as I said just before, it really does not come close to many of the high points of labor militancy by really any measure, whether you're looking at the number of strikes, the total number of participants in strikes, the total number of days lost, the duration of strikes, etc. Mm-hmm. So that's one major thing to keep in mind. A second major thing that really jumped out at me was that both labor protests and strikes, and just a quick note on their methodology, they distinguish between protests and strikes based on whether an action stopped work or not. So if something stopped work, they called it a strike. If something did not stop work, it was called a protest. So just want to mention that. So taking that into account, whether you were looking at protests or strikes, these actions were very heavily concentrated among already unionized groups of workers. So unionized groups of workers accounted for something like, if memory serves, something like 95% of all of the estimated participants in the labor protests, and something like 98%, like almost 100% of all of the estimated participants in strikes. So that really jumped out at me. Further is that, this makes sense when you take into account the fact that it's mostly already unionized workers participating in these things, is that protests and strikes were concentrated by industry. and they tended to be concentrated in industries that, relative to others, have some meaningful degree of union organization. Above all, we're talking about healthcare and education, which together accounted for something like 60% of all of the actions in this data. And then related to that, related to the industrial concentration, another thing that jumped out is the heavy geographic concentration that really jumps out from the data. There were actions, protests, strikes from all over the country, but if you kind of drill in and look at the states where these actions occurred, you see pretty quickly that states like California, New York, Illinois, in particular, which accounted for something like half or more of the total estimated participants in these protests and strikes, and then some other states where union density is relatively high. They're accounting for most of the actions in this data. So in short, what you could say is that, collective action in the workplace, whether you're talking about protests that don't stop work or strikes that do stop work, they're by and large taking place where organized labor still retains some residual sources of strength, whether that's geographically speaking or industrially speaking. And in that kind of context, then spreading this ferment that is undoubtedly out there, spreading these protests, spreading these strikes, beyond their current industrial and regional confines is going to depend, I think, on unionization in new places. And by places, I mean both in terms of industries and in terms of geography.
I want to pause on this question of union density for a minute because I think we're really used to kind of looking at union density as sort of a gauge or like a measure of the labor movement in general. And I've recently been hearing some pushback from people who say, well, obviously it's one measure, but it's not everything because, just looking at union density obviously can't capture, non-union activity. It can't capture things like Fight for 15. It can't capture what people are calling the Great Resignation. It obviously doesn't capture labor activities like slowdowns. And I think the criticism is that, sort of post-Taft-Hartley, it's very difficult to form a union, right? So I guess the question is why should we still look at union density as a kind of a barometer of labor?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. I think that it's certainly not entirely without merit. I don't think that, union density is the only measure of working class strength that you can look at, whether you're talking about the U.S., but I think particularly when it comes to other countries. A lot of other countries, for example, have kind of labor relations regimes where a worker doesn't necessarily need to be a member of a union in order to be covered by a collective bargaining agreement. The country that comes to mind in this regard is France, which has a lower level of union density than the U.S., but the government, through various ways, extends collective bargaining agreements to basically almost the entire workforce, with some exceptions. And all the other things that you mentioned are, I think, certainly true and worth taking into account. But I think especially here in the U.S., union density is probably one of the best, if not the best, measurement of working class strength and power that we've got. It overlaps almost entirely with the rate of collective bargaining coverage. As I said, there are other countries in the world where those two things kind of can really diverge, but in the U.S. they are more or less the same. As I argued in the piece, and as others have argued, the thing that makes having that union organization so important is the fact that it provides an ongoing, kind of permanent organizational vehicle for working people to assert their interests at work and in politics, and to engage in various forms of collective action. By and large, or unorganized groups of workers, and by unorganized I mean without a formal union or a collective bargaining agreement, have not been engaging in strikes. They have not been engaging in labor protests. Obviously, you see a lot of things like job switching and quitting and what have you, which is, I think, gives you something of a sense of workers' level of confidence in their ability to find new jobs and to organize better deals for them, or to negotiate better deals for themselves on an individual basis. But when we're thinking about the power of the working class or working people in kind of more formally political or institutional terms, I think that this is probably still one of, if not the best measurements of labor strength. And if that's going down, then that's not good. If it's going up, then that does bode much better for the fortunes of not just organized workers, but working people in general in the U.S.
I want to ask you now about kind of the protests and the strikes that did happen, because you had mentioned that something like over 95% of protests and then like a significant number of strikes were basically over within a day, right? I think that that's really surprising because obviously a lot of the attention has been on sort of these longer open-ended strikes that happened at the end of last year. So obviously, any strike, any protest is a good thing. It's a sign of, workers sort of flexing their power against the boss. But the fact that the duration of some of these strikes and protests, or should I say the overwhelming majority of these strikes and protests have been so short, what does this say about the state of the labor movement right now, or about like what unions can and cannot do in this moment?
That's a good question, and I think in certain respects, kind of a tricky one, because it's probably not the case that longer open-ended strikes, for example, are necessarily a sign of the strength or power of that particular group of workers that's out on strike. It may be a sign of desperation, of weakness, and of employer power in that particular situation. So it can be kind of tricky to sort of suss this out, and I think that you really have to look at a lot of these things case by case to get a sense of what's actually going on. That being said, though, if you look at the data over time, you can see a clear trend in terms of the decline in the duration, the size, number of days lost to strike action, et cetera, over time. And during the high points of labor militancy during the 20th century, those numbers are way up, and it makes sense. It's like if you've got huge numbers of workers going out on strike, they're going out on strike for especially for issues that don't necessarily have to do with like routine subjects of collective bargaining, but have to touch on questions of like of the organization of work, kind of managerial prerogatives, things like that. Those strikes are going to go on for a longer period of time. So I think generally, yes, it's probably not great that the trend has been towards shorter and shorter and shorter strikes and protests, for sure. One flip side potentially of that is like, hey, if the workers are well enough organized and they're more strategically located enough in a workplace or in a production process or whatever the case may be, that they could just kind of blow the whistle for 20 minutes and get somebody get somebody reinstated, or get a couple extra bucks because they're taking on additional work or whatever the case may be. Then kind of the quickness of the action may speak to their strength. But I think in general that and you can see it if you look at the historical data, the very clear kind of secular decline in duration, in size of strikes, etc. I think really does point to the erosion of the strike weapon as a source of labor power in the United States.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.